Okay, so first off, we should probably talk a little bit about who I am so that you know. My name's Ganesh Cherian. I live in Wellington, New Zealand. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, and I have been a lifelong member. My parents joined the church when I was very young, and I've lived in Wellington pretty much all my life except for doing a few things. I went to Church College, which is a church high school in Hamilton, and then a Mormon mission in Auckland. I married a fellow missionary who was from Seattle, and I've spent a bit of time in the States. I have 5 uh, fantastic children who are all adults now, and I'm a bit of an amateur historian, but also a avid investigator of the church and its claims, and also understanding some of its nuance and its history and kind of who's who in the crew. So I'm no scholar, I'm no academic, but I hopefully can explain to you a lot of things about the church, particularly about the Book of Mormon and especially Joseph Smith. I spent a great deal researching his life, the records of scripture that he brought forward, and how they impacted the Church of Jesus Christ as it developed and expanded throughout the world. So as we go through this journey together, hopefully I can be of use to you in learning and understanding and also conceptualizing what has happened throughout history, and it's going to be lots of fun. We are going to talk about Joseph Smith's life, his family, what his environment was like, and how this all played into the Book of Mormon coming forth, and also some of the ideas and themes of the Book of Mormon, and how that then played out into a church that he effectively started and progressed through his life and through the next 10 years. Joseph Smith was born in 1805 and he died in 1844. So he was only 39 years old, but he accomplished quite a bit in that time. And we're going to have a look at how he managed to do that and what kind of impacts that had on both the church and the wider community and even the world at large. So I hope you have an enjoyable time with me. So the whole reason for doing this TikTok is because I've written a book about the deep connection between Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. It's an ambitious project. It's 600 pages long, and it seeks to evidence how Joseph's life, his environment, his family all played into the understanding and the content of what was written in the text. This is quite a confronting idea because most members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints understand the Book of Mormon as being ancient and historic. And so the idea that Joseph's worldview ended up in the Book of Mormon is jarring at best. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Book of Mormon was deeply influenced by Joseph in a number of key ways. One, that it was autobiographical. It had pieces of him, pieces of his family in the text. That it was pseudepigrapha, that he employed ancient voices to write his understanding and his feelings about various topics. That it was a biblical fan fiction, that it really kind of built on the Bible and particularly the New Testament, and also that it was a bit of a manifesto, an understanding of how Joseph saw the world and how he wanted it to be better and how he thought it could be better. And at 24 years old, that's an ambitious idea. And for some people, that's what makes the Book of Mormon really special. So we're going to go through this evidence by evidence, text by text, and have a look at Joseph, have a look at his environment, compare it to what is in the text of the Book of Mormon, compare it to what happened in the early church, and kind of contrast how these ideas developed, how they ended up as words on a page, and how they ended up influencing the new church that he formed, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and how that church evolved, particularly in the first 10 to 15 years of the rest of his life, and then on into the modern era, which we are in now. So I hope you can stick with me. And if you've got some great things to share, do so in the comments. We're going to go through this together. Thanks.
Hey everybody, I have been asked recently to talk more about the Book of Mormon, so I want to share the piece of advice that I usually give when people ask me how to better understand it. If you want to understand the Book of Mormon better, you should approach it as a piece of 19th century literature. This is not to say anything about its origins or to say you cannot maintain a conviction that it is an English translation of an ancient source text. It is to say, whatever its origins, it is written in 19th century English for a 19th century target audience. This is made clear by a number of literary and linguistic conventions that are native to that time period. So the better you can understand the literary, rhetorical, ideological, historical context of that time period, get your 1828 Webster's out, read some of the other literature from that time period. The better you can do that, the better you will come to understanding. Thank you for the question. This is probably the biggest challenge that's facing Latter-day Saint apologists these days. How can they account for the Book of Mormon as a translation while also confronting the indisputable fact that it quotes from biblical passages that were composed centuries after Lehi and his family left Jerusalem with the brass plates? And even more challenging, that it quotes directly from the King James Version of those passages, including some translation errors and idiosyncrasies unique to the King James Version. Some scholars try to discount the documentary hypothesis or Deutero-Isaiah as a way to sidestep the challenge. That has not ultimately proven to be successful. I don't think it can be. I think apologists are going to have to confront the fact that Joseph Smith played a role in the articulation of the text in some way, shape, or form.
That's Dan McClellan. He's a scripture translation supervisor for the church, and he runs a popular TikTok channel in the specialty, which is biblical languages. It's worthwhile checking out. He doesn't talk about the Book of Mormon very often, but when he does, I've included a couple of clips that he has. But if you look in the comments, he always states that the preponderance of evidence is the Book of Mormon is a 19th century work. So that's quite a different take on the Book of Mormon than most LDS members have. And I think it's going to become a more predominant one, where you can see the same thing kind of coming through with Terrell Gibbons' writings and also Richard Bushman. And so part of what I'm going to try and kind of explain and show is those kind of 19th century Joseph Smith additions to the Book of Mormon, and we're going to go through that in depth over the next little while.
Hey, thank you for the question. Yes, ultimately the goal of the analysis of the Book of Mormon as literature is to be able to quantify each passage and to be able to show where it likely came from, what arguments it was engaging, what it was trying to accomplish, linguistically where it fits. And once we do that, then we can draw some broader conclusions. And I think there are a couple of things I would say about that analysis. So far, only a small handful of passages have been evaluated in this way. For instance, I published a paper a few years ago on 2 Nephi 25:23, arguing that rhetorically it fits within a trajectory of Protestant discussions about grace. And I showed that the way it was using the English fit within usage that ran from the late 18th century to the mid to late 19th century. So that was the linguistic as well as rhetorical context that I argued for this passage. And we like to be able to do that for all the passages. And I will say two things. One about what I anticipate we're going to find, and then one about what I don't think we're going to find. As people are conducting these analyses, we are discovering that this text is a lot more complex and a lot more sophisticated than we have long thought. This is not to say that it is inspired or that it is from the ancient world. It's just to say that this is a lot more complex and a lot more sophisticated. than we have long given it credit for, which is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons that I think we are not going to find that the entire text came from the mind of Joseph Smith. I don't think that's a conclusion that's going to make much sense once we have all the data analyzed. So whether that means, and we have some linguists that are arguing that the English of the Book of Mormon more closely represents early modern English, so 15th, 16th century, and how or why that is, they have not explained and show no intention of explaining. So I don't know what good that argument is. But when we have all the data, I think we're going to find that there are multiple sources for what's going on in the Book of Mormon. Whether it's 19th century, 18th century, 16th century, 6th century BCE, I don't know. I'm excited to see where it goes. And I am open to any of those conclusions or any combination of them. The conclusion that I think is least likely, I'm open to it. If that's where we go, then great. But I think it is least likely is that Joseph Smith just invented it all in his head on the fly. I don't think that makes much sense. So, hope that helps.
Here, Dan McClellan is issuing a bit of a challenge, and so we're going to see if we can meet it. Stay tuned.
This is from a Bible, and it says, the most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. In regards to the Book of Mormon, is that language from these verses of Mark, which we now know were attached to the Gospel of Mark by an unidentified scribe, likely a couple hundred years after it was originally written down, appears in the Book of Mormon.
Hey everybody, this video provides an accurate description of the overwhelming scholarly consensus regarding the end of the Gospel of Mark, and I think it adds to the already substantial data that indicate that the text of the Book of Mormon was articulated in the light of a 19th century edition of the King James Version of the Bible, even as that text is being altered in places. I would add that I don't think there is an adequate account of the origins of the Book of Mormon in circulation, whether one argues that God did it or that Joseph Smith made it up or that Joseph Smith stole it. None of the accounts, I would argue, adequately grapple with the data regarding the relationship to the King James Version, the linguistic data, the historical data, the literary, the theological data. And I think it's because the accounts are pretty much entirely just aimed at operating at the level of either proving the text is authentic or a fraud. And as long as we're only engaging the data to the degree they serve one of those two rhetorical goals, our engagement is always going to be inadequate. So for anyone out there actually concerned with better understanding the origins of the Book of Mormon, we all have much better to do.
And this is what I think that Dan McClellan is trying to illustrate with his video, is that there's a lot of polemics around the Book of Mormon. There's those who defend it as prophetic and inspired because that's what they see in it. And there's those that try to expose it as a fraud, flawed, because they see that also. But there's so much more to the Book of Mormon. There is linguistic richness. There is story. There is engagement in 19th century understanding and situations and experiences. There's Joseph and his worldview, but his family. And so there's so much more to understand about the Book of Mormon. And so that's the kind of understanding that I'm really looking for in this project, digging deep into knowing what the Book of Mormon is, how it came about, what are the factors that influenced it, and also how did that play out in the church.
So how do we qualify what Dan McClellan is saying, that the preponderance of evidence suggests that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century work? And if so, what role does Joseph Smith play in the production of that text? I've identified 7 things that I think are important that we're going to go into depth under. One, it seems that Joseph Smith's prejudices end up in the text of the Book of Mormon, and we can see that again and again. Number 2, his New World privileges also appear in the Book of Mormon. So that's also a feature that we can see. 3, a number of 19th century theological discussions and conflicts find their way into the Book of Mormon. and we're going to document those. Number 4, he utilised many 19th century features which were available to him in the production of the Book of Mormon. Number 5, there's a lot of repeated texts which suggests that the author of the Book of Mormon is not a collection of authors or ancient people, but they were the same person. And this happens again and again, and we'll go into depth with that. 6, there are a number of things that the Book of Mormon just simply gets wrong, and they seem to be things which are totally 19th century kind of environment things. And 7, Joseph had a good reason to be involved in the Book of Mormon and its production, and we'll go into depth with that also. So, and it's not just that the Book of Mormon reflects Joseph's understanding of his environment in the 19th century, but it especially reflects Joseph's life and the prevailing society of roughly 1827, 28, 29, conditions that would be very different 10 years later when his circumstances in his worldview had changed completely. So that's something that we're also going to explore as part of this, is that when the Book of Mormon was written, it was written in a particular way, and that was quite different than the church and Joseph another 10 years later. So we can see that again and again in the text, and also what then kind of subsequently happens in the church. So those are some things that we're going to really look at in depth, and hopefully be able to get quite a lot of understanding out of, and hopefully be able to kind of confirm what Dale McClellan's kind of saying, and that there's this preponderance of evidence. Okay, a quick history lesson. The Book of Mormon was published in 1830. It propelled a very young 24-year-old Joseph Smith into the collective imagination of a new America. Before this, he was pretty much unknown. It was an incredible story. Joseph said that he had been visited in 1823 by an angel, a resurrected prophet from ancient America, who told him of a record of scripture on gold plates that were buried in a hill near his home. He subsequently went yearly to the site. The angel directed him, and then in 1827 he was able to take these records and some means by which he could interpret them, and began working on the Book of Mormon. In 1828 he kind of began this project with his neighbor as scribe, that was Martin Harris, who was also financing the project because Joseph was very poor. And they ran into some difficulty early on, which put a halt on the Book of Mormon for quite some time. And in 1829, the project resumed in about March, April, with a new scribe, Oliver Cowdery, and progressed through to about June, July 1829, after which time it was pretty much complete. The unpunctuated pages needed to be formatted, and this was given to a printer. It took many months, but it was published in March of 1830, and Joseph and Oliver started the Church of Jesus Christ in April of that same year. Because of persecution, they ended up relocating to Kirtland, Ohio in 1831, and they also established another kind of settlement community in Missouri as a kind of a special New Jerusalem, Zion. By 1838 in Ohio, things had become very difficult, and Joseph had to flee, went to Missouri. They ended up getting kicked out of Missouri and spilled into nearby Illinois, and as refugees, pretty much. So the church was kind of tenuous at first. They found a bit of a reprieve in a place called Nauvoo, Illinois, and had 5 or 6 years of relative peace. And then Joseph was subsequently murdered in 1844. So he died by the time he was 39. It was quite quick life, and it was quite spectacular. History lesson number 2. So after Joseph was killed, there was a succession crisis. Nobody knew quite who to follow. The person who would have most likely have succeeded Joseph was his brother Hiram, but Hiram was killed at the same time. And so there was a lot of conflict about who to follow. And there were a few different people who were vying for that position. One was Brigham Young, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The other was Sidney Rigdon, who was the first counselor to Joseph in the first presidency. Another was James Strang, who was a charismatic member who had just joined the church. And also Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, and probably more importantly, the mother of his young son, who might have been his successor, Joseph Smith III. In the last few years of Joseph's life, he had started practicing polygamy in secret, and this had caused a number of conflicts within the membership, and particularly the leadership. And so the succession crisis kind of split under, whether to follow polygamy or whether not to. And Brigham Young was a proponent of polygamy, and pretty much the rest weren't. And so it kind of split the church in half. Brigham Young ended up taking a large group of saints and moving them through to Iowa, and then on to Utah and the Great Salt Lake area, pretty much because they were fleeing the persecution that might come about because they were practicing polygamy. And lots of the members who stayed in Nauvoo initially followed James Strang to Wisconsin, but when that didn't work out, they ended up kind of reorganizing, and they were called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, under Emma Smith and Joseph Smith III as their prophet. The Brigham Young in Utah operated kind of quite a theocracy, but ended up having quite a lot of conflict with the US government because of polygamy. And so that went on for half a century, really, till subsequent church presidents had to abandon polygamy, and that branch of Mormonism centered in Utah is the biggest branch of Mormonism, and there are many. I've identified the 2 biggest ones, but there are lots of breakoffs from that. What I also want to say was the Book of Mormon was everything for these people, particularly the early saints. They joined the church because of the Book of Mormon, because it was kind of, it suggested there was a prophet on earth. The Book of Mormon was everything to them. And so it was a really big deal. So right about now, I better give you a synopsis of what happens in the Book of Mormon, a bit of an overview. If you're not a member of the church, this will give you a good idea of what the Book of Mormon covers. And if you are a member of the church, you might be a good refresher. So the Book of Mormon opens in 600 BC, so 600 years before Christ, when Lehi, a Jewish prophet contemporary with Jeremiah in the Bible, has a vision of doom and is commanded by God to take his family and flee Jerusalem. God then provides a way for them, along with another family, to cross the ocean to the Promised Land, which is the American continent. The journey is narrated by Lehi's righteous younger son, Nephi, and when Lehi dies soon after arrival in the new land, Nephi and his wicked older brother Laman split. What follows is rival nations where the majority of the time the Nephites, the descendants of Nephi, are white, righteous, and industrious, and the Lamanites, the descendants of Laman, are dark, wicked, and idle. Successive Nephite prophets narrate the rise and fall of the people as they cycle through being righteous to wicked to righteous again, while anticipating Christ's birth. In 33 AD, after his resurrection in the old world, Jesus Christ visits the Americas and preaches his gospel. This crowning event is the apex of the narrative, and this ushers in 200 years of peace and prosperity. But by 400 AD, however, the Nephites had fallen back into extreme wickedness, and the Lamanites and the Nephites stand off for a last great battle in which the Nephites are annihilated. The second to last Nephite prophet, Mormon, records the destruction and compiles the writings of the past 1,000 years into the thing which is called the Book of Mormon. Mormon then passes this record on to his son Moroni, who writes a little more and includes the writings of an even more ancient group called the Jaredites, who left the old world at the Tower of Babel, who were also annihilated shortly before Lehi arrived with his family. Moroni then buries the record for Joseph to find in 1823. And Moroni is identified as the angel that came to Joseph and let him know that these records were buried in the hill near his house. So that's a good overview of what the Book of Mormon covers. So in this video, we're going to talk about the composition of the Book of Mormon because it's useful to know how the Book of Mormon is made up. The Book of Mormon is split into 15 books, compilations, and they're principally named after their author. Some of these are very long, 30 chapters, and some are very short, just one chapter. And so there's kind of 15 of these. The first couple are written by Nephi, so they're 22 and 33 chapters respectively. Nephi passes this record on to his brother Jacob, who writes 7 chapters. Jacob passes on to his descendants, Enos, Jerem, collection of others under the name of Omni, and they're all 1 chapter each. Then there's a little blip in the middle called Words of Mormon, which we're going to talk about in a second. Mosiah is 29 chapters, Alma 63, Helaman 16. Then there's 3rd Nephi, which is 30 chapters, and that's that one I talked about where Christ comes, so that's the apex. Then 4th Nephi is 1 chapter. Mormon writes, and he writes 9 chapters. And then he passes on to his son Moroni. Moroni includes the Jaredites record, which is called the Book of Ether, and that's 15 chapters. And Moroni finishes it off with 9 chapters. So that's how it kind of is compiled. In that there are 588 pages of text and 270,000 words. So it's quite substantial. There's a couple of things you should know. One is that the Book of Mormon was dictated to Martin Harris in 1828, or began dictating to Martin Harris, and that part of the Book of Mormon, the beginning, was lost. Joseph Smith started dictating again in March of 1829, and Oliver Cowdery came along, and he started in Mosiah. So Mosiah is the earliest part of the Book of Mormon that we have. And he continued right through to Mormon and Moroni, and then Joseph Smith, dictated the first part of the Book of Mormon again, this time with the narrative of Nephi, which is Lehi's son. So the beginning book of the Book of Mormon is the latest in the dictation process, and it's kind of split into 3 parts because where Words of Mormon are, in Omni covers 200 years in 1 chapter, and 4th Nephi covers 300 years in 1 chapter. So the whole of the Book of Mormon is 1,000 years long, but 500 years of that is covered in 2 chapters. So something to add to the composition. Remember I talked about that Words of Mormon little blip, the 1 chapter. So the dictation was done from Mosiah through to Moroni, and then the first part of the Book of Mormon was redone from 1st Nephi through to Omni. So there's a bit of a gap between Omni and Mosiah, and Mormon put this 1 chapter in which kind of seeks to harmonize that break. So you can look at the Book of Mormon in 3 parts. The first part, which was dictated last, that's from Nephi through to Omni. The second part, which is Mosiah through to 3rd Nephi, which was dictated first. and then Mormon through to Moroni, which was dictated second or in the middle. And that's going to be really important when we talk about some of the characteristics of the Book of Mormon, to know how it was dictated and when it was dictated. It makes a really big difference. Actually, the time frame between when Mosiah through to Mormon was done was pretty much 2 months. It was from March, April through to the end of May and into June. And then the first bit, Nephi through to Omni, that was basically done mostly all in June, and the Book of Mormon was kind of completed by July. So the whole of the text of the Book of Mormon, those 588 pages, 270,000 words, was done in 3 months, dictated in 3 months. And so that's kind of good to know too. It's going to come into play. Most of the authors of the Book of Mormon are father and son, sometimes occasionally brothers. In that kind of 1,000-year history of 600 BC through to 400 AD is the Nephites and the Lamanites. There is 17 generations of authors that cover that time frame. And in that section I told you about from that Moroni put in, which is the history of the Jaredites, so that is even longer. That's maybe 2,200 BC through to 600 BC, so maybe 14 to 1600 years. That is covered in 15 chapters, so very, very fast. And again, most of it is sermons, so there's not actually that much history in the Book of Mormon, but we're going to talk about that. So those are kind of the things that how the Book of Mormon's kind of arranged, and we'll kind of set up the stage for how we can kind of analyze it. So I hope that that's a good overview, and let me know in comments what you think. We should also talk a little bit about other scripture. Joseph would work on 2 other ancient scripture projects during his lifetime. One in 1831 and 32, which was a retranslation of the Bible with Sidney Rigdon. And as part of that, they by revelation came up with another section of scripture called the Book of Moses, which is now canonized in the Pearl of Great Price. And basically it talks about Moses and his kind of dealings with God one-on-one. Then later in Kirtland, Ohio, Joseph worked on some Egyptian papyri that he bought and brought forward a record which was called the Book of Abraham, which was supposed to be a record of Abraham's dealings in Egypt many thousands of years ago. That was worked on in 1836, and then there was a big hiatus, and again in probably 1842. So, and that is now also canonized in the Pearl of Great Price as the Book of Abraham. One other thing that you should be really aware of too is the Doctrine and Covenants. So the Doctrine and Covenants, or shortened as the D&C, is modern revelation, a collection of revelation that Joseph Smith got. Now, these revelations were originally recorded at the time, and some of them overlap the Book of Mormon, so they happened at the same time that the Book of Mormon was being translated. And so we can have that's really important, because we can see some correlations between the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and those early revelations. So these were compiled into a book called Revelations Book, and this was printed in 1833 as what's called the Book of Commandments and Judas and Persecution. It morphed into the Doctrine and Covenants, which was first published in 1835 and then revised again a couple of times in Joseph's lifetime. The Doctrine and Covenants is really interesting, and it gives us kind of a side-by-side with the Book of Mormon and also the early church practice that give us understandings about how the Book of Mormon was
brought forth, but also how it impacted the early church and then some of the changes that happened afterwards. And so the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses, and the Doctrine and Covenants are all really important to know about. In this video, we're going to talk about the production of the Book of Mormon. What did it look like? Well, it's something good to know is that it was dictated in 3 parts in 2 different locations. So the dictation was originally done in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where on Emma's, Joseph's wife's, parents' property. Emma was the first scribe, and then Martin Harris took over. This was April 1828, and it took about 3 months. Martin Harris took the manuscript back to his home in Palmyra, hoping to convince his wife of the project, and then those pages went missing. They were never recovered. We refer to them as the Book of Lehi, and the retranslated pages, or the replacement pages, were 116 pages, and so we refer to it as 160 pages, but we don't know. We don't know how long it was. It may have been much longer than that. The project didn't start again until March of 1829. Emma started again, but then Oliver Cowdery came and became the principal scribe, and he was the scribe right through to the end, from basically April through to the end of June into July. But at the beginning of June, the persecution was so great in Harmony, Pennsylvania, that everybody relocated to the Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York. And so that was a big shift. It took a few days, and it interrupted the process, but the Whitmers were very accommodating, and so it went there. Joseph and Oliver Cowdery never talked about the dictation process. The only things that they said in their lifetimes were that the Book of Mormon came forward by the power of God. But the other scribes, Emma Smith, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer, all described a very similar process, that Joseph would take his seer stone, and he would place it into the bottom of a top hat. He would put the top hat over his face to exclude the light, and then he would speak words that he saw on the seer stone. They would write it down. They would repeat it back to him. He would be able to tell them if they needed to correct anything, and then if it was correct, they would move on to the next part. This is what's described as a tight translation, which means that those scribes absolutely believed that the Book of Mormon was word for word exactly what was needed to be spoken. The plates at this time were often covered or not even in the house. They weren't needed for the dictation process at all. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to talk about Joseph's early life. And to do this, we need to understand Joseph's family. Joseph's parents were Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith. And they grew up in Vermont, in New England, in the United States. And both of their fathers had fought in the Revolutionary War. So that was a big part of their kind of heritage. They were actually fairly well off. They came from upper middle class lives. They owned their families owned farms. They worked pretty hard. Joseph Smith Senior was a school teacher. He's quite well educated. Lucy Mack similarly. When they got married in 1796, Lucy's brothers gave her a huge inheritance, a sum of $1,000 to start her family, which was massive back then. So they started their little life together in relative wealth. But tragedy struck pretty early on. In 1797, their first child was born and subsequently died. And that was traumatic for them. 1798, they had their next child, Alvin. And then in 1800, Hiram was born. In 1801, they moved to Raleigh, Vermont, where Joseph became a merchant. He was sick of being a farmer, and he tried his hand at kind of selling things. But during a ginseng speculation, he lost
all the family's money. And Lucy even had to bail out the debts with the inheritance she had got. So they went from being relatively wealthy to being dirt poor. On top of this, in 1802, Lucy almost died with consumption, tuberculosis, and she credits God for saving her life. In 1803, Sophronia was born, and penniless, they moved back to the farm in Tunbridge as tenants. And then in 1804, they moved to Royalton, Vermont, to farm on Lucy's father's Solomon Mack's farm. And then in 1805, on the 23rd of December, Joseph was born in Sharon, Vermont. They then had Samuel in 1808, Ephraim, who was stillborn, in 1810, and in 1812, they moved to Lebanon, New Hampshire, in relative wealth. But in 1812, tragedy hit again, and they got typhoid fever, which was devastating to the family. So by 1812, the Smith family finances had slightly recovered, but then they were hit by typhoid fever. Sophronia almost died. Joseph got an infection in his leg, it almost got amputated. It became a famous story in Mormon folklore. This plunged the Smiths back into huge debt, and things were pretty dire. 1813, Catherine was born. The family had to move back to Norwich, Vermont. 1815, there was an eruption in Indonesia that caused the world to be blanketed by ash, and this caused widespread crop failure. The Smiths were already poor, and New England suffered a great deal over this, and so things got from bad to worse. In 1816, Don Carlos was born, and they had to make the agonizing decision to move, and so they fled New England for Western New York to the frontier, and there they went to a little place called Palmyra and opened a little business there. Things went fairly well for them. By 1820, they were able to buy a little farm on credit near Manchester, New York. And in 1821, Lucy was born. She was the last of the Smith children, and the Smiths had 11 children in total, 9 of whom survived. In 1822, the Smith family started treasure digging with Joseph as a seer. And in 1823, Joseph told of this idea of a record in the hill behind their house. But later in 1823, Alvin, who was 25 at the time and kind of the de facto head of the family by this point, because Joseph Smith Sr. had kind of become unreliable, he got an infection, and because of a bit of doctor malpractice, he died. It was horrific for the family. He was kind of the major breadwinner, and it plunged the family back into kind of destitution. Alvin was also not baptized. The Smiths didn't baptize their children. Like other kind of people of the time, they didn't believe that was important. And at his funeral, the Smiths were shamed by this. And as a result, Lucy and Hiram and Sophronia all joined the Presbyterian Church, splitting the family. In 1825, Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. went to Pennsylvania to dig for treasure. And that's where Joseph meets Emma. Joseph met Emma in 1825 when Joseph and his dad were on a treasure dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania. They were employed by a man called Josiah Stowell, who was looking for a buried Spanish silver mine and believed it to be in the area around the banks of the river. Joseph boarded at the Hales residence and was quite taken with Emma, although Joseph's profession made him unsuitable to Emma's father.
Emma's father, Isaac Hales, was particularly suspicious and thought that Joseph was unworthy for his daughter's affections. The silver mine was never found. The project was abandoned. But during the time that Joseph and his father are away, some people came to collect on the mortgage of their farm in Manchester, and Lucy didn't have the money. So she had to sell the farm, and basically they were allowed to stay there, but just as tenants, and this was another huge blow. Not only were they poor, but now they were effectively kind of destitute. After the treasure dig went wrong, Joseph returned back to nearby Harmony in Bainbridge and tried to continue to see Emma. And then eventually in 1826, Josiah Stoll's nephew brought Joseph up on fraud charges and tried to swindle his uncle. Joseph was convicted on these charges, but because he was young and many people spoke for him, it was a fairly minor infraction, and he was kind of warned away. But this kind of gave him a big change and a big taste in his mouth about his treasure digging, that it could get him into trouble and that people might not necessarily appreciate it. So this changed his kind of trajectory quite significantly. In 1827, in January, Joseph wanted to marry Emma, so he returned back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and he and Emma eloped without her father's permission, and Joseph brought her back to Manchester to his parents' house, which was pretty much a shack. Wasn't very comfortable. It certainly wasn't the upper middle class world that Emma was used to, and things were pretty dire coming into the end of 1827. So in 1827, Emma is with Joseph in Manchester, New York, staying at their parents' house. It's pretty cramped. It's not very pleasant. Joseph is laboring during the day. Emma's, feeling pretty homesick. But in the midst of this, Joseph takes Emma to the hill nearby his house, where the plates are deposited, and basically brings them home to his house in Manchester. This causes quite a stir in the area, because while treasure digging is a big part of their kind of communal culture there, nobody had actually found anything, and now rumours were circulating that Joseph had gold plates. His previous treasure digging friends and associates were miffed at him that he hadn't shared this kind of loot, and so they proceeded to try and get them off him. So it caused quite a lot of turmoil for the Smiths. People were casing the place, sometimes breaking in. It was pretty terrible. At the same time, Joseph and Emma were having a bit of trouble. Emma was very homesick. She missed her parents. She missed her life, and things were tough in Manchester. So Joseph went to go to Harmony and pick up some of Emma's possessions so that he could kind of help her be more comfortable. In that trip, he had to talk to his new father-in-law, which he hadn't, and Isaac was devastated that Emma had run off. Even more devastated that Joseph was the cause. But despite all this, he offered the couple a sanctuary that they could come and live at their property and be more comfortable. And so that's what they did. Joseph went back, he collected Emma, and in January 1828, they moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania to be with Emma's parents. Joseph had the plates, but covered. Isaac wanted to know about this project
that Joseph was involved in, and Joseph would not let him see the plates. So, and because it was still kind of linked to treasure digging for Isaac Hales, although he tolerated what they were doing and put him out on another property on another house on the property, he did not support them. 1828 was when the Book of Mormon was first worked on. So the couple were living on the Hales farm, a little cottage at the back of the property. Joseph would put a seer stone into his hat. He'd put the hat over his face. He would speak. Emma would write. Emma would recite back what she had written. Joseph would make corrections, and this process would go on again and again. They were still working the land. Joseph had to provide board by working on the farm, so this was intermittent. There were other chores that needed doing, so it was kind of a slow process. At some point, Martin Harris left his place in Manchester and came to Harmony, Pennsylvania to see the couple. He'd given them money to relocate, and he was really interested in the project and wondered if he could be a part of it. Joseph started using him as the scribe, and so they repeated the process, and this went on for a couple of months, and they produced something quite substantial. Martin was worried that his wife Lucy was, thought that this was a fraud, and so he asked Joseph if he could take the manuscript back to her to convince her of its truthfulness. Joseph agreed reluctantly, and Martin went home with the manuscript. Joseph and Emma were at this point working on having a baby. Emma was heavily pregnant, and she had a very difficult birth where she almost died, and the baby was stillborn. It was a devastating moment for the couple, and it was a really tricky one. It's so bad indeed that Joseph started going to church at Emma's Methodist congregation, where her uncle was a pastor. But the rumours of plates and what he was doing made his involvement there very painful and embarrassing, particularly to the family, and so he quit. He then went to Manchester to visit his folks and to see Martin Harris about the manuscript. And when he went there, the manuscript was gone. It had disappeared. Martin couldn't find it, and the whole project, everything that they worked on for months, was lost. It was really a devastating moment. They were already pretty poor, but to have lost all this time on a project and nothing, it was huge, a very big blow. So at the end of 1828, things were pretty dire. Joseph had lost the manuscript. He blamed himself. It was tough, and of course, he saw Martin as being this really bad guy. He started to get other revelations in his seer stone. He wrote these down. These became the Doctrine and Covenants, and one of these first ones, he blamed Martin. And later on, he got another revelation that kind of blamed Lucy and kind of conspiring people who had aimed to halt the project. So the winter of 1828 was a bit bleak, and it got even worse for Joseph. Lucy actually brought him on charges of fraud relating to her husband, and he had to go to court again. This time Martin really stood up for him, and so the charges were dismissed, but it was still a kind of a harrowing blow. Again, being in the courtroom, again being accused of fraud, it was not pleasant. But Joseph was determined. He started to dictate the Book of Mormon again with Emma as the scribe, and Martin actually came to make a visit. Again, we see him these connections in the Doctrine and Covenants. Also, Joseph's dad comes to visit. Joseph needs some help, so he kind of sends for Samuel, his brother, to come and scribe for him. But what actually ends up happening is that Samuel brings Oliver Cowdery, who had been staying as a boarder in the Smith home and who had learned about the project. And so Oliver Cowdery came, and on the 7th of April, Oliver looks like he loaned the couple some money, and then he became the principal scribe on the project. The money he loaned them was able to kind of secure a bit of a mortgage over the property at the Hales farm, which meant that the Isaac Hales and his wife weren't quite as overseeing what they were doing. And so this gave Joseph a lot more freedom. And with Oliver as scribe, they could work on this project pretty heavily each day, and that's what happened. Probably 4 to 5 hours a day, a little bit of a break, a lot of time to talk, but this meant that the Book of Mormon progressed rapidly. Like I said earlier, it started at Mosiah. Joseph was still hopeful he would be able to recover the lost manuscript that Martin Harris had done. Progress on the dictation of the Book of Mormon proceeded quite quickly under Oliver Cowdery. He and Joseph got on pretty well. They became friends quite quickly. Martin Harris had been quite a lot older than Joseph, but Oliver Cowdery was just that little bit younger. And Oliver fancied himself too as a revelator. He used a divining rod, and soon into talking with Joseph, he wanted to have access to the seer stone to be able to see if he could also produce scripture. This didn't turn out well, and basically Joseph got a revelation that Oliver should just be the scribe, which kind of stopped that kind of competition between them. But Oliver was told that he would be able to translate and bring forth other records later. So Oliver was pretty excited about that prospect. It never happened, but that certainly was the promise at the time. So their work proceeded quite rapidly. They went through Mosiah and to Alma, to Helaman. Along the way, they had a few questions, which Joseph got revelations for, which ended up being on the Doctrine and Covenants. By 3rd Nephi, they learned about baptism, and so they felt strongly about that, got a revelation, and ended up baptizing each other. 4th Nephi, then Mormon. At this time, things had got pretty hairy at the Hales residence. They were being harassed, and although the parents were kind of trying to take care of them, it was getting quite bad. Joseph was looking for another option. Oliver had made really close friends with a guy called David Whitmer, and he asked David if they could come and live on their property and complete the project. So David talked to his parents and they agreed, and so really quickly in the beginning of June 1829, both Joseph and Oliver, along with Emma, relocated to the Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York. And this was extremely quick. And then the last bit of the Book of Mormon, from Mormon through Ether, Moroni, and then all were completed at the Whitmer farm. And then, of course, there had to be some decisions made about what to do about the missing part of the beginning. And so Joseph received a revelation that was never going to come again, even though he had a seer stone to see what had happened to it. And so they began on 1st Nephi, 2nd Nephi to replace that text. And that got completed about the end of June into the beginning of July 1829. The Whitmers gave Joseph and Oliver a lot of sanctuary, and the Book of Mormon was completed at their place. But their house was busy. There were a number of children. There was a lot of work. These people were, preoccupied with the Book of Mormon, and then even when it was finished, there were a lot of other things to do. there was securing a publisher trying to get it, copied again, because Joseph was worried about, losing any manuscripts. So Oliver Cowdery went through and did a whole nother copy of the Book of Mormon. They then did a printer's edition, and when they secured some printing in nearby Palmyra, they had to go back and forth with printed pages, trying to keep it secure, but get it printed. And printing took a long time. The text that Joseph had dictated had no punctuation, so no capital letters, no full stops, no sentence structure. So all of that had to be added to the text in order to make it make sense. Sometimes that was really difficult to do. The printer actually did all of that, and there's the original manuscript, of which only about 18% survives, and the printer's manuscript, of which most of it survived. But you can see that, you can view it, you can see the punctuation that was made, and the printer made a lot of calls which may or may not have been doctrinal at all. So it's quite a fascinating project. There are lots of websites in the Joseph Smith Papers project. You can go and have a look at the text. You can have a look at the language. Some of it needed to be cleaned up. The grammar was terrible. The spelling was atrocious. The sentence structure was not always great. So there was quite a bit of revision in that first little bit. But what rolled off the press in 1830 in March was basically a book that was really densely packed with information. There were no verse numbers, there were no kind of paragraphs. It was just all one run of text, which made it very difficult to read. But people did, and they were very curious about this new Golden Bible. But it's not in the form that we kind of use it today, with verse structures and chapter headings and all those kinds of things that give us a context of what it looks like. And once the Book of Mormon rolled off the press, the next thing was the organization of the church, and that happened on April 6th, 1830. And that was kind of the beginning of the church. And I should backtrack here just a minute, because I missed out some important information, and that is, while at the Whitmers, there were a couple of things that happened that are really important. Firstly, the Book of Mormon title page was written, which was at the end of Moroni, and that was sent to the the Copyright Office to secure a copyright for the Book of Mormon even before it was completed. And of course, then they had to decide what they were going to do about the lost pages, and so Joseph had received this revelation that it needed to be redone, but with a different portion of the story. And so the first bit of the Book of Mormon is now the writings of Nephi, the son of Lehi, rather than Lehi. So it's told from a different perspective, but it tells the same time frame. And Nephi makes a point a lot of times in the first bit of the Book of Mormon that his writing of this particular space is exceptionally spiritual, so more spiritual than history. And so the beginning book of the Book of Mormon is exceptionally religious, more so than Mosiah through Alma is. So it's very densely packed in that regard. One of the other things that happened at the end of the Book of Mormon, and that replacement text at the beginning, was also a idea that there would be 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And so these 3 witnesses were chosen from Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, his best friend, but also kind of part-time scribe, and also Martin Harris. So effectively the scribes of the Book of Mormon, or the major scribes of the Book of Mormon. And they were privileged to view the Book of Mormon plates by an angel. And so they talked about this and this was put into the beginning of the Book of Mormon. And then 8 other people were also allowed to handle the plates and testify that they were physically real. And so these were a collection of Smiths, the Smith brothers, and Joseph's father, plus the Whitmer brothers and brother-in-law Hiram Page. And so everybody who was kind of around the project, or at least the men, were given the opportunity to be witnesses to the Book of Mormon, the physicality of the Book of Mormon. And so that's what happened, and those are recorded in the beginning of the Book of Mormon. On the 6th of April, 1830, the church was organized with 6 members. Joseph and Oliver were designated first and second elder because the Book of Mormon said that this was going to be an egalitarian kind of a church. But they soon found that with too many people not really in charge, and this was not going to work. So Joseph soon got revelation that he was in charge, and Oliver was secondary. And the first year was exciting because so much was happening. The Book of Mormon had been published. There was a lot of excitement. It was also tough because people were investigating, but also asking questions, and there was some persecution. The other thing that was tricky was that people who were joining the church came from that same folk magic tradition that Joseph had come from. They believed in seer stones. They believed in rods. And so Joseph wasn't the only person with a seer stone. In fact, Hiram Page, who was the Whitmer's son-in-law, he had a seer stone that was fairly powerful. He managed to get quite a few revelations. He started getting revelations about all kinds of things about the church, and going off on things that Joseph wasn't up with. And so Joseph had to stamp that out. He told Oliver to take care of it, to tell Hiram Page that his revelations were from the devil, that his seer stone was rubbish, and Joseph took back control. And this kind of happened again and again through 1830 as the church tried to expand. There were little branches in Manchester and Colesville and Bainbridge, and so there was moving around, trying to keep things going and build momentum, but also this idea of who was in charge and how people got revelation. That was a tricky endeavor. Joseph himself got plenty of revelation during this time, and one of the biggest things that people were asking about was, where was this New Jerusalem, this Zion that the Book of Mormon talked about? And so Joseph got a revelation that it was in Indian land in Missouri. So they began to look at that and seek to try and convert the Lamanites. And so one of the most important things that happened in 1830 was a mission to the Lamanites with Olive Cowdery and some new members, particularly Parley Pratt, the Whitmers, and they went on a mission, and they ended up going through Kirtland, where Parley Pratt had lived and had a congregation. That's where Sidney Rigdon was converted, and that became a big part of the church. These missionaries that Joseph sent out, particularly Oliver Cowdery and a new member, Parley Pratt, they went to Kirtland, Ohio on their way to Missouri, and Parley Pratt's pastor, or former pastor, Sidney Rigdon, got very excited about the Book of Mormon, and the people around there did too. And so they joined en masse, and there was a massive congregation of people who joined the church in 1830 in and around Kirtland. And Sidney Rigdon went to meet Joseph. So he went up to Fayette and Manchester to meet with Joseph, and ended up really hitting it off with Joseph Smith. They seemed to get on really well. Sidney Rigdon was much more accomplished and older pastor, but he really grabbed hold of this new movement. And at the same time, and at the end of 1830, things were getting really tough for Joseph. He was going through a lot of persecution. They were, bringing him up on charges. He was going to court again, and so Sidney Rigdon convinced Joseph that the communal living situation that was happening in Kirtland that he had established was right in line with the Book of Mormon, and that maybe that was where they should go. And Joseph received a revelation that they should pack up, and all of the people from that area should sell their farms or move, whatever they needed to do, but get to Kirtland. And so Joseph and Emma and Joseph's parents, who were, again, remember, were just tenants on their land, so they could just leave at any time, they all packed up and they moved across the country through to Kirtland, Ohio. And there they met the other people who had just newly joined this church, and basically formed a kind of a communal system in Kirtland, Ohio. It was a real win for Joseph. It provided a lot more safety. There were already members there, but they were quite different. These members had come from, Sidney Rigdon's really more charismatic religious movements. They didn't kind of understand the whole seer stone thing that New England refugees in Western New York did. And so there was a little bit of tension, certainly quite a bit of, fitting things around with regard to Kirtland. And on top of this, of course, Oliver and the others had gone to Missouri, and they were having trouble there trying to set up in Missouri in this Zion. It wasn't quite coming to pass like they thought it would. So we've talked a lot about this timeline of Joseph Smith and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and we've got to about the Kirtland area. We will pick this up a little bit later. But I just want to go back for a second and talk about Joseph's early life, because I think it really is important to understand. We kind of downplay his poverty in the church. It wasn't that he was poor, he was destitute. His family was destitute. And there were some contributing factors to this. Firstly, Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack were from fairly well-to-do families. They had land, they had money. When the Smiths were married, Lucy got an inheritance from her brothers to start their life together. And Joseph, not wanting to be a farmer, tried his hand at being a merchant. But during a ginseng speculation, he lost all the family's money, including Lucy's endowment, which she used to pay off their debts. And then they kind of bounced around. They got a little on their feet. Then tuberculosis struck. They were in poverty again. They got back on their feet. Typhoid fever struck. Then, working hard, the War of 1812 happened. Then again in 1815, the crop failures due to the volcanic eruption happened. And so they bounced around from, with this boom and bust in New England, predominantly in Vermont and New Hampshire, which is on the screen there. And then they were so poor they had to flee New England and go to the frontier, which was at that time the Western New York. So they went to Palmyra and had a little shop there, and then Manchester. And, we've talked about going to Harmony for the treasure dig. We've talked about Alvin's death that plunged them into more financial turmoil. We also talked about Joseph going back to Harmony and getting Emma and bringing her to Manchester. Again, these kind of booms and busts, and they were desperate there. Then they moved back to Harmony because they were so desperate to live with the Hales. And but then during persecution, they moved to Fayette, to the Whitmer farm. And then, the church was organized around Palmyra and Manchester, and they bounced around before they then went on to Ohio. So it was a fairly tumultuous start to Joseph's life. You can't understand Joseph Smith unless you understand his parents, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack. They came from quite
well-to-do backgrounds, but they came from quite different religious backgrounds. And Joseph Smith Sr. was from a kind of a universal background, and Lucy Mack was from a congregational background, which meant that Joseph Sr. applied Christianity as a very moral way of living, but didn't take too much into practice. And Lucy, on the other hand, was very, orthodox in her views, or at least she inherited that from her parents, and particularly after the tuberculosis, where she felt like that God had really saved her. She was a lot more pressuring of the family to be involved in organized religion. And this came to a head, of course, when Alvin died, because Alvin was not baptized because of the conflict of the parents, but also lots of other people didn't baptize their children. And so when Alvin died at 25, it threw the family into financial turmoil, because Alvin was the kind of a breadwinner of the family after Joseph Sr. became a bit unreliable. But it also threw the family into religious turmoil, because what was going to happen to Alvin, and how could they explain it? And because of this, Lucy and Sophronia and Hiram all joined the Presbyterian Church, and Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. and were quite bitterly opposed to this, or at least Joseph Jr. followed his father. And so religious kind of turmoil was a big part of their lives, as well as financial turmoil. And of course, without Alvin in the picture, and needing a kind of a breadwinner, Joseph took on that role as, even as a very young 16-year-old, to kind of be in charge of the family. And so this was quite a big change for Joseph, and a lot of pressure. But he also was really worried about his parents and their conflict, and he wanted to help resolve that. He believed his dad a good man. He followed him in the treasure digging kind of realm, and gained a lot of favor and prominence with his father. But Lucy was always kind of a bit suspect of this kind of profession, because it tended to throw the family into even more financial turmoil. And so she was wary of that. And so Joseph spent a lot of time resolving conflicts between his parents. A major premise of this investigation into the Book of Mormon is that it was created in 1829, when Joseph was 22, 23 years old, and it reflected his worldview and kind of experience up until this point. But as soon as the church was organized in 1830, things changed dramatically for Joseph. He moved to Kirtland, Ohio, with Sidney Rigdon, and together they tried to implement this utopia that the Book of Mormon had talked about. At the same time, the missionaries in Missouri had formed Zion and Independence, which was Jackson County, Missouri, and they tried to implement a kind of a communal system there. And so there were two centers of the church, one in Kirtland, one in Independence, and they were a long way away from each other, 1,000 miles. And transport was difficult. Communication was also difficult. So they kind of operated slightly independently of each other. In Kirtland, Joseph, along with Sidney Rigdon, tried to implement this utopia that the Book of Mormon talked about, and added new scripture to the kind of canon and revelation that was coming thick and fast as this new church tried to find its feet. In Missouri, the saints there were having problems with their neighbors and eventually got kicked out of Jackson County, which meant that Joseph kind of had to do something about it. He formed a militia. They marched across the country to try and redeem Zion, but when that kind of failed, they held a kind of awkward peace with the Missourians, and the saints settled in a nearby county. Back in Kirtland, Joseph had continuing revelations, including needing to build a temple. So a temple was built in Kirtland, which is in the background of this video, and that was completed in 1836. But this plunged the church into a lot of debt. which caused some problems, including some speculation in trying to get out of debt by forming a bank. This fell over badly and burned a lot of the early saints, and so there was a kind of a great kind of backlash against Joseph and Sidney. They had to flee for their lives. They went to Missouri, where the saints were kind of still a little bit refugees. This caused a big influx of members into Missouri, which scared the Missourian people, and ended up in a lot of conflict and then an expulsion order. And then the saints spilled into nearby Quincy, Illinois, as refugees, and eventually set up in Nauvoo, which was by the banks of the Mississippi. So things happened really quickly in these areas, and it was quite... So let's talk about who's who. Who are the major players in all of this? First off, it's of course Joseph Smith Jr., who this is all about. He was born in 1805 and he died in 1844 at 39 years old. We know about Joseph Smith Sr., his father. He was also a Book of Mormon witness. Lucy Mack Smith, his mother. Alvin Smith, his oldest brother, who died at 25 and plunged the family into turmoil. Hiram Smith, who is Joseph's older brother, who didn't rise to prominence till the 1830s in the new church, and he was also a Book of Mormon witness. Samuel Smith, Joseph's younger brother, who was also a Book of Mormon witness, one of the 8. Martin Harris, Joseph's farming neighbor who financed the Book of Mormon and was Joseph's first scribe. He was also a Book of Mormon witness, one of the 3. Lucy Harris, that's Martin's wife, who was suspicious of Joseph and who took him to court in 1829. In Harmony, Pennsylvania, there was Josiah Stoll, who sought Joseph out to lead a treasure dig in Harmony. Josiah Stoll's nephew or relation, who took Joseph to court in 1826. Emma Hale, of course, who became Joseph's wife when he eloped with her in 1827. Isaac Hale, who's Emma's father. Nathaniel Lewis, who's Emma's uncle and local Methodist preacher. Joseph Lewis, who's Emma's cousin, who embarrassed Joseph. Olive Cowdery, who came to Harmony and became the scribe for Joseph. He became his close friend. He married one of the Whitmer girls, and he's also one of the Book of Mormon witnesses. One of the 3, he became a major part of the new church. In Fayette, New York, we have David Whitmer, Olive Cowdery's close friend, who also became a Book of Mormon witness, one of the 3, and was a prominent early church leader. Peter Whitmer Sr., who is David Whitmer's father, and the Book of Mormon was finished at his home in June of 1830. Peter Whitmer, one of the brothers, Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, John Whitmer, all brothers who were also Book of Mormon witnesses, one of the 8, and Hiram Page, their brother-in-law, who was a prominent early member and Book of Mormon witness. And then in Kirtland, Ohio, we have Sidney Rigdon, who was a preacher and prominent first member, and then of course Brigham Young. So those are the major players in this scene. Okay, people, we're almost there. We're going to now start to discuss the evidences which support the premise which I've been talking about so far in the introduction, just to give you a basic background. So we're going to talk about how Joseph and his worldview influenced the text of the Book of Mormon. And then we're going to talk about how Joseph changed in the years afterwards and how the church 10 years later became quite different from the Book of Mormon text. So in order to do this, we're going to go through a number of things, and we're going to do it in a certain way. Firstly, we're going to look at prejudices that Joseph and his environment had that ended up into the Book of Mormon. Number 2, we're going to talk about privileges that Joseph felt and that his wider communities felt that ended up in the Book of Mormon. 3, we're going to talk about theology the doctrines, the understandings, and the ideas of God which informed the Book of Mormon and how they changed in the early church. And number 4, we're going to talk about 19th century features available to Joseph that became part of the Book of Mormon. And then 5, we're going to talk about some textual anomalies, some things which shouldn't really be there, but for some reason are in the Book of Mormon. We're going to go into them in detail. Number 6, we're going to talk about things that Joseph absolutely got wrong about ancient America, which ended up in the text. And then we're going to talk about why Joseph might have done all this. And lastly, number 8, we might talk about a little bit about how this kind of played out and why it's so important today. So those are kind of the 8 key areas we're going to talk about, and we're going to do them one by one with various evidences. But we're going to do it in a certain way also. We're going to do a lot of text and passages from the Book of Mormon, and we're going to, wherever possible, we're going to do this in chronological order, or at least the order that it was dictated. So, for instance, Mosiah was dictated in March of 1829, and so if our references start with Mosiah, it's going to start there. Alma, April 1829, 3rd Nephi, May 1829, Moroni, June 1829, 1st Nephi, 2nd Nephi, all in June of 1829. So we're going to do it in that order because that will tell us a lot more about what it is that the Book of Mormon contains and how it's made up. And so hope you enjoy.